Dr. Amber McZeal, who will be supporting us in understanding that deeper, understanding that in the context of our work as mental health practitioners, and providing with us some strategy and technology to do that, to get real close and intimate with the feelings that surface for us. And so Dr. Amber McZeal is a writer, vocalist, sacred scholar, and activist. She utilizes sound therapy and guided somatic imagery to engage the knowledge of the body within an interactive and liberatory arts practice. In 2018, Amber launched her organization, Decolonizing the Psyche, where she weaves somatic praxis with Afro-Indigenous spiritual technologies and social justice, deep coloniality, and efforts to end oppression and create a more humane social relationship. So welcome, welcome, Dr. Amber McZeal. I'm incredibly grateful to be in the space with you, and I'd love to hand it over to you.
Just to briefly unpack a bit of what I'll offer, I am a community liberation, indigenous, and ecological depth psychologist. And I love the way that Oriana presented this, that today is largely about feelings, because that is a central theme of a depth approach. It's to make what is unseen more seen, to make the unconscious more conscious, to hopefully support that vision or intention of self-attuning and becoming more aware. And specifically what I want to offer today is a bit of a kaleidoscope into, I love the way that you worded it in the opening, Oriana. Why are educational spaces a site of psychic attack? That much like in trauma-informed approaches and practices, we begin with what happened to us, what happened to me. And so the same applies for an institutional space. What happened to the institutional space, and why is it a site of battle and conflict? So my framework centers on decoloniality and African Indigenous archetypal psychologies and epistemologies, or ways of being and knowing. So a part of that begins with a simple phrase for me. It's a guiding phrase, that oppression distorts relationships. Oppressive logic, human hierarchies, class, caste systems, all of those things disrupt and distort the way that we relate to ourselves, to each other, and to the more than human world. And a decolonial approach, just to move away real briefly from the jargon of it, from the language of it, which is great. But at the end of the day, it's about wholeness making. I'm sure all of you are quite familiar as educators, as mental health practitioners. In these institutional spaces, we often run into the silo effect. This department doesn't talk to that department. The knee bone doesn't connect to the shin bone. All of this is ludicrous. And we find ourselves trying to move toward more holistic approaches, right? More holistic understandings. The good news is, or what I found in my journey, it's all by design. The silos are by design. And there is a way that understanding that at a deeper level can help mitigate some of the internalized stress and frustration and sorrow, deep grief or despair, at trying to maintain a sense of efficacy, being an effective educator. So yeah, that's a little bit of the overview of that. So I wanted to keep in connection with faces as much as possible, so I did not prepare a PowerPoint. So all of this is going to be in the spirit of those indigenous ancestors, all oral tradition and storytelling. So I'm going to tell a story. When I speak about, or when scholars speak about coloniality, decoloniality, things like that, we're talking about a time frame of about 400 to 600 years. And within that, a lot of things were invented. As it stands, this philosophical framework is established like this. If the last 400 years is a house, the house is premised on two axes. One was the invention of race. That's not only Black racialized people, it's white racialized people, it's the invisibilized indigenous people. It's basically creating the ladder or the human hierarchy. And the other axis is the invention of, or the formation of extractive capitalism, for-profit, the urgency of for-profit businesses, institutions, et cetera, the bottom line. So that's the logos or the logic that has been driving our steam engine, if you will, of civilization for the last 400 or so years. And what makes that important for this gathering here and for what each of you provide to the world is that within that project, education is a massive pillar. How we know what we know, the epistemologies, whose knowledge is valid, whose knowledge is not, ways of knowing that are accepted, those that are not, those that get marginalized. The destruction of knowledge systems or ways of being and knowing. So it makes the project really hones in on the importance of education as a site of either maintaining or transforming, dismantling the perpetuation of that logic. So in the spirit of attuning and attending, I wanted to unpack briefly the naming, the norming, and the nurturing through an embodied practice. So what is the naming? Offering context, which I have a short time to do, but I hope it plants seeds of curiosity and spaciousness. Offering the context in a bit more, with a bit more depth of why educational settings are a site for attack on our psyche. Offering a context for this conflict. In the past couple of years, it's been the CRT, but there are so many more, right? Offering a context for the symptoms experienced by educators. What Oriana referred to as that activation, offering a context for those large emotions. And then naming the sensations. So this is cultivating a somatic awareness and sensibility. Why that's important in the context of decolonizing ourselves, which is creating more wholeness, is that just like people were relegated to the margins, African people, indigenous people, female gendered people, so are characteristics like emotions over rational mind. Another thing that was relegated to the margin was the body itself. From the Enlightenment era, they call him, his name is Descartes. I think, therefore I am, right? And that Cartesian dualism, that Cartesian binary preferenced, it prioritized the mind over the body. Thus, we still carry this way of being where the body is considered irrelevant, something meant to override, repress, something meant to relate to as a machine. It's mechanized, right? Something designed to push through and socialize to bulldoze through things and experiences. So a part of wholeness making is reclaiming the body as a site of knowledge, the body as the site of all experience, really. And unpacking norming. So one principle, one quality or characteristic I want to push forward here is undoing grind culture and finding and carving a new path forward. I want to note here how the pandemic ushered in a global sacred pause. And there were many voices coming out from many different fields: healthcare, public works, public service, of course, education, saying, we don't want to keep doing it the way that we've been doing it. In fact, the way that we've been doing it, now that we have had a sacred global pause, seems quite disharmonic, if not dysfunctional. And so I want to carry that sentiment forward into this space and really bring it alive, because there's a lot of truth to that. Many folks in the global human family found an opportunity to stop the old pattern of being and ventured toward creating a new one. So my prayer here, my hope is that this space can be blessed with that too. And then norming also incorporates cultivating new practices. I mentioned one of them was cultivating that somatic sensibility, and the other is what I call cultivating critical consciousness, or C3. And I'll do that just by offering a bit more introspection into educational sites as and why they are a battleground. And then moving into nurturing, we'll have some time for engaging embodied practice toward the end of this offering today. How a deeper validation of the body, your activation, your joy, your charge, your grief, how does this support being a full human being, a capable educator, a balanced leader? And then there are some practical offerings that I shared with the SCRR team, specifically as it relates to the CRT battle, decolonizing classrooms, anti-racist or decolonial pursuits in the classroom. And I'll share with you a personal story about how that article, which is Anti-Racist Values for the Classroom is the title of it, how that article came to be. A note here that while the language might center on anti-racist within decolonial values for the classroom, it really is not limited to race, period. But I wanna really presence that, because race, anti-racism has become a buzzword, and unconsciously, there's a belief that it only implicates one group of people, when it's not true. It's the overarching theme of a dehumanizing project. And so at the end of the day, you could substitute anti-racist or decolonial for creating more humane social cultural relations. So decoloniality is all about wholeness making. So the final piece I wanted to add here, specifically as it relates to crises within the classroom, I was touched in preparing for this offering, having conversations with the SCRR team. I'm not an educator in a classroom, and so I have to defer to the wisdom of those who are on the front lines, to the lived experience of those on the front lines. But hearing about some of the kinds of crises that have emerged in the past few years, whether it's increased rates of suicide, the school shooting phenomenon, or phenomena, because there are many across the country, personal and subjective experiences of students who are dealing with trauma in the home that they inevitably bring into the classroom. And so I want to weave in here, first of all, just taking a sacred pause to acknowledge the gravity of these things and the gravity of the vicarious trauma, the impact on educators that actually produces. But I'm not but, and along with that, I wanted to offer an idea from Frantz Fanon, who is one of the first decolonial psychiatrists. Um, his book, written in the 1950s, called Black Skin, White Masks, kind of chronicles the way that colonialism affects the psyche, or the project of dehumanization, period. And one of the concepts he pushed forward was sociogeny. And he stated, he was charged with treating people in an asylum in Algeria, which was under French colonial rule. And he actually resigned from that post because he could not comply with the mandate of his higher ups, right? Basically to just diagnose, push through, diagnose, medicate, et cetera. And his response to them was, I cannot diagnose these people outside of the context that they are living within. And I find within the mental health world, if not other institutions, we often try to diagnose or treat or whatever people outside of the context in a very siloed way. So the invitation here is how does one, or is one, an educator supported in putting child symptoms in a context? How can we tend and understand the myriad crises that occur within schools without taking into consideration the larger pressures and forces that influence these crises? And that critical consciousness might help build in the breadth and the spaciousness to recover and renew. So sociogeny, just briefly, sociogenesis is the development of a social phenomenon within a context. The phenomenon is sociogenetic, thus it indicates that it is socially produced, as opposed to being ontologically given, immutable, or static. So it's not something innate about the kids. It's a symptom that is emerging as a result of what they're living in and through. So taking a sacred pause again to honor those who devote their lives to nurturing the mind, hearts, and souls of our children. This is an honorable mission and a tremendous responsibility. So in this sacred pause, I also want to transmit a witnessing of these things to you, the educators, by acknowledging the shared experiences of what it yields. The tremendous grief. Oriana referred to this when she talked about the desire for educators to feel efficient, that they're having an impact, that they're affecting change, that what they're offering to the students is being received, and that it's fostering growth. And when that's not possible, it produces frustration. So I wanted to unpack some of that frustration, specifically in the context of grief. Grief has been part of our collective and shared experience over the past few years, and especially within educational sites. So grief has myriad expressions: rage, sorrow, disassociation, all kinds of things. And I want to offer 5 main reasons or grounds that grief emerges within. Grief can emerge over the death of a loved one. Of course, we well know that. Grief also emerges, one of these big emotions, over the loss of a dream or a vision, the loss of hope or an expectation. Grief can emerge through feeling the pain of others, what I call that vicarious trauma, a sense of collective grief or cultural trauma. Grief can emerge simply in response to the challenge of the moment that we're living through, the times we're living in. And finally, simply the act of being alive. Like there's an almost existential weightiness to being on the earth and having to wake up and carve your way each day. So in the spirit of just bringing the unconscious conscious, I wanted to offer those 5 pillars. And a question here: what if we regarded and tended our grief as holy and human? What if grief was the expression of love looking for a place to go? What would be the practices that we incorporate that move us away from bulldozing through life, overriding what we sense and feel, denying what we think or see? So instead, welcoming and tending our grief as holy and human. My hope is that this can support a normalization of acknowledging when teachers, when educators are activated, when your nervous systems are saturated, when you're needing to take a break and a breath, that this tiny gesture is an act of disrupting the grind culture. This tiny gesture is an act of recentering the body as a site of valid knowledge and knowing, that the body knows when it's enough. And to do that is to be decolonial. Simple, huh? So I know that we are pushing close to the close of our time here, and I want to give space. There, of course, is so much more to offer and share. But I wanted to offer just a few notes on why specifically sites of educational sites are a battlefield. So in the project of colonization, right? The project of marginalizing ways of being and knowing, destroying other knowledge systems, what they call epistemicide. We've consistently seen, and I'm sure educators know, there's been a consistent pushback from the time that the colonial project of dehumanization occurred and began. There's a concurrent stream or river where many, many liberatory-minded people, humane-oriented people have pushed back. And they've said, we want to bring in other ways of knowing and being. Where we have had narrowed and siloed expressions of history, the myth of American exceptionalism, just to take one practical example, look at all the ways that folks have developed curricula to go alongside the Thanksgiving holiday. Just in 2020, I believe, they passed a law, what's it called? Designating November as Indigenous Peoples Month, right? Because they said, we need to stop just teaching this horrific myth of Thanksgiving that excludes a whole history of people, that doesn't tell the full truth, right? And at the spiritual and psychic level, that creates a ripple effect. It creates a ripple effect in a sense that those who want to maintain the myth of that delusional history are very, very much offended. They're very, very much offended by all of the change agents who bring in a more comprehensive and expansive history. And so the educational site receives that backlash, as well as all of the people within it, the educators. And so that wave, that pushback is what then generates the great pressure, the symptoms, the emotional experiences, the fatigue of trying to push back against a bureaucratic system, right? I want to land here before pivoting toward an embodied practice with you all. I want to land here with a personal share, a personal experience, which led to the article that I shared with the team called uh, Anti-Racist Values for the Classroom. And it comes out of an experience I had going through graduate school where I was studying somatic depth psychology, and it was a predominantly white institution, and I valued deeply the education I learned there. I valued deeply the education and insight into the intra-European colonial project, the repression of women and women's bodies within Europe. And I wanted to know more about my own lived and historical experience. So I would ask consistently, could we have discussions about race as a psychic and somatic phenomenon? The invention of race as a form of somatic violence and psychic pressure and trauma. Often I was met with silence until one day I was met with what I call now a racist love letter. Someone anonymously left a little letter under my chair, and it pulled on the age-old insult of a Black woman's anger. And the note was about how, oh, Amber is so, I won't go into the details of it, but you can get the gist that I was so angry that it was dominating the space. I wasn't angry at all, but I found it peculiar and interesting, right? That was the response to my justified curiosity. And so from that came a series of focus groups and discussions, and two really talented professors gathered all that data, and they created a series of anti-racist or decolonial values for the classroom. Along with that, it's a beautiful, I see you clapping there. Thank you, Robin, for the cheers, because it's a lesson in the alchemy. And I wanted to share that in the spirit of really honoring the deep, big emotions that come up by sharing the way that I honored the emotion of anger, even though I wasn't angry. But anger is a powerful emotion that signals something that I love could be threatened with harm. And so what I did is a series of practices on paper with art, and I drew what they call in sociology, the volcano model. And the volcano model is something that I used or was shared with me in my early therapeutic days, where at the top of the volcano is the eruption, that's the anger, the secondary emotion. And in the body of the volcano are all of these other primary emotions which have led to the eruption. Some of them include feeling embarrassed or scared, feeling stressed, helpless, rejected, frustrated, attacked, unsure, disappointed, lonely, worried, offended, disgusted, feeling grieved, feeling overwhelmed, feeling tricked. And all of these could actually be the pressure and the impetus to the eruption at the top. The second layer of alchemical tending I did was to incorporate an Afro-Indigenous framework through the Orisha Agayu in the Lukumi tradition out of Cuba. In Orisha, you could understand as an archetypal pattern of consciousness, and Agayu is the volcano. The Agayu consciousness is represented or symbolizes a massive jumping over of obstacles. So I would actually sit with the letter and meditate on the consciousness of Agayu and use that as an embodied practice to sort of catapult me over the racial trauma and the racial stress that I was experiencing in the institution. And then finally, it led to the generative prayers and mantras and meditations that the anger was no longer a negative or emotion that should be despised or that one should be ashamed of, but it's instead the rupture, the capacity to compost. It's the energy of the phoenix rising. It's the energy of disrupting dysfunctional patterns or ways of being. It's the energy of transformation and illumination. And finally, it's the consciousness of clarity. So thank you for allowing me to share that. So just taking a moment wherever each of you are to drop into a more embodied space by following your breath, that spirit or consciousness of me that animates your flesh, gives you the experience of being alive. And gently moving your conscious awareness from the top of your head, allow it to expand through your head, through your neck, down past your shoulders, traveling past your heart, to land in the seat of your belly, your second brain. And as you settle into that embodied space, see if you can envision a golden shimmering ball floating in the center of your head. We call this the Ori, the spark of consciousness in every human being. The site of your unique gifts, talents, offerings, aspirations. And as you watch this gold ball floating, see if you can allow it to expand and fill up the entirety of your head, pushing out all other thoughts. Feel what it feels like to be filled up with yourself. As you attune to this feeling, noticing the sensations of your body, 37.2 trillion tiny red blood cells floating in the body, rivers of blood, the minerals of bone, the constant beating of heart like fire. And in your own internal voice, whisper to each cell, I accept my body as it is in this moment. The ruptures around me do not diminish or decrease my love and acceptance of my body. Notice any images, narratives, sensations that might arise. And as you prepare to continue this ritual of attunement, of deep compassion, take a moment to offer gratitude to all of the experience that have led you to this moment now. And at your own pace, gently begin bringing yourself back into the room fully by feeling your sit bones, feeling your feet, reorienting by finding windows and doors. And when ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you very much, Oriana. Thank you to the SCRR team. And thank you to this beloved community.